Okay, hello. I'm David Healy, and I've been asked by Bob Whitaker to give this talk about antidepressants and homicide. And like a talk recently about antidepressants and coming off them and the problems with them, this talk is going to be based totally on the things that I've been hearing from people who are on these pills. And in this case, it's hearing some things that a lot of you will find pretty shocking. You won't have heard before. But the bigger problem in all this is the issue of homicide brings to a focus the problems that we have that we don't pay too much heed to with prescription drugs in general. When things go wrong, how do we get justice? How do we get the problems recognized? And homicide is the one area where this becomes particularly complex, and we need to think about how to sort it out. Now, the challenges that it poses us begin with this first slide here, which was very soon after I had email put on my computer for the first time. I got an email from a law firm in the United States asking me to get involved as an expert witness in a suicide and homicide case because they couldn't find another credible witness in the United States. This was over 25 years ago. And rather than things getting better, they've got worse. So one of the big challenges we have in this area, not just homicide, but any adverse effects of pills, is how do you find an expert who figures they understand how to make your case, which may be the opposite of what pharmaceutical company-sponsored evidence-based medicine says these drugs can do. Fewer and fewer doctors are confident that the clinical skills they have can really make a case about what's happening to you on these drugs. So, let me introduce you to Chris Pitman and his grandfather. And Chris didn't get on tremendously well with his father. His mum was dead, and his father and he often had arguments. And after one argument, he ran away from home, and he ended up in a children's mental health unit, where for no good reason, they put him on an SSRI. He ends up on Zoloft. The unit call his grandparents because they hear that Chris has lived half his life there, and he's gone to school from there on the school bus with all sorts of people and gone to church from there with the grandparents. And the grandparents come and pick him up. But this time, when he begins going to school on the school bus from there, he fights with the other kids on the bus in a way that he hasn't done before. In church with the grandparents, he is agitated and restless, kicking the bench and things like that. And after one of the trips to church, the grandparents say to him, and he's only been on the pills for 2 or 3 weeks at this point, they say to him, look, if this goes on, we're going to have to send you back to your father. That night in bed, Chris says he hears a voice tell him, shoot them. Now, he's only 12 years old. He gets his grandfather's gun and he shoots both the grandparents in bed. He then gets into the Jeep and drives off and is picked up a few miles away by the police, who are kind of puzzled with this kid behind the wheel of a Jeep and ask him what's going on. And he says, I don't know. I'm not sure what's happened to my grandparents. So the police go to the grandparents' house and find it burnt to the ground. Chris ends up in jail. It takes 4 years before he is actually brought to trial. And at this point, he's 6 foot tall. So he's a very different looking Chris to the 12-year-old who has killed his grandparents. And the South Carolina press talk about the case in terms of, well, is he evil or is he chemically compelled? And the jury decide he's evil. He's responsible for this. He ends up getting a 30-year jail sentence. And the judge brings out the issues that are at the heart of this talk, which is he says, it seems to turn the whole medical system on its side if you can't rely on the medication your doctor prescribes you. It potentially forces you into a situation of lifetime commitment if that drug induces an effect of which you are unaware when you go on it. There's something disconcerting about that, Judge Daniel Piper says, probably of a legal nature that's troubling me. And there is. This is the question we're going to try and answer right at the end. What's the disconcerting issue and how do we put it right? So, no jury has ever let a person who has killed other people walk free from court, not guilty, saying the drug has actually caused the problem. The man on the left there is Donald Shell, and his wife Rita, and daughter Alyssa, and granddaughter Deborah. And Tim Tobin is Alyssa's husband, and he isn't there 48 hours after Don Shell gets put on Paxil by his family doctor and shoots Rita and Deborah and Alyssa and himself. Tim takes a case against GSK, and a jury in Wyoming, which is full of tough hombres, decides GSK were responsible for the murders. But they didn't have to let a criminal walk free. The criminal, so-called, is dead. This brings home the point. Let me show you one more case where the verdict strangely happened in exactly the same week as the Tobin case. And this is in Sydney, Australia, where David Hawkins has killed his wife. He's been taking Zoloft. And the defense lawyer makes the case to the prosecutor and judge, who agree with her that if he hadn't been on Zoloft, he would not have killed his wife. And they let him walk free from court. But the key thing is, this doesn't go to a jury. So the legal system can look at it and say, well, it's obvious the drug has caused this. But when it gets presented to a jury, that's us, the range of views we have great problems with a case like this. And Pfizer and GSK and the other companies also had a problem with these two cases happening at the same time. And they began to devise a plan to make sure verdicts like this didn't ever happen again. In the case of the Pitman case, the prosecutor in that case had a Zoloft prosecutor's manual prepared by Pfizer, telling him exactly how to manipulate the jury to get the right outcome. Now, the history of all this goes back 300 or 400 years to Lord Chief Justice Matthew Hale in the UK, who said, there's the insanity defense, by which he meant, if you're delirious, if you're raving mad because you've got a high fever or a physical illness, or you've been poisoned accidentally by your doctor being unskillful and giving you the wrong drug for you, and you end up in a delirious or frenzied state, you are not guilty. Now, the reason Hale and everybody was comfortable with this insanity defense was the guy on the left here, who you can see is kind of raving mad. And he's either going to be dead from some physical illness, or the poison is going to be out of his body and is going to be restored to normal shortly afterwards. And people will be able to see that, well, this is not the man who killed whoever else, So they're not letting, it seems obvious they're not letting a criminal, a hardened criminal, walk out free. But in contrast, a little over 200 years ago, Philippe Pinel said, well, look, you can have madnesses without delirium. And, the person's not stark raving mad. He's like the guy on the right. And the courts grappled with this and they said, well, look, we can't let this guy go free. The only time we might think about that is if he's got a delusional belief that somebody else is trying to kill him, and in self-defense, he kills them. So it's the kind of defense you'd offer if somebody really was trying to kill you, and in self-defense, you kill them first. But you don't walk free from court if you're that kind of person. You end up going to hospital for the rest of your life, which may be worse than going to jail. In between the old insanity defense and the new one, there's a bunch of behaviors that are automatic. And when you walk in your sleep, for instance, and if you kill someone, this has happened, people have ended up walking free because the view has been that, well, they didn't intend. The key question here is intent. Are we happy that the person didn't intend to kill themselves? Or didn't intend to kill other people? So this is an extended automatism. Then there's reflex ones where, let's say you're driving a car or you're holding a gun and a hornet comes near you and you move quickly to try and brush the hornet away and the gun goes off or the car plows into someone and they end up dead. Again, we don't think that's murder. You didn't intend it. Okay? Now, there's a bunch of other things where people have tried to argue, well, hypnosis is a bit the same thing and multiple personality is a bit the same thing, but courts haven't really bought that. Then there's Albert Tyrrell over there on the left, who in 1846 murdered a woman and claimed he'd been walking in his sleep and got acquitted by the jury because of that. Most people think Albert wouldn't get acquitted today because he didn't just killed the woman. He also burnt the house down. And a jury today would figure, well, that wasn't automatic. You know, there's a degree of intention there, and they'd find him guilty. And in Chris Pitman's case, the jury said we thought the drug had bad effects on him, but it was probably the torching of the house that led them to think, you know, he was more in control of what he was doing than the defense, that is me, have been trying to persuade us. Okay, there's a joke about this, which is a hotshot lawyer is talking to a group of wealthy women after dinner. And he says to them, look, most of you have probably thought about killing your husband. If you do, come to me, I'll be able to get you off. Provided you remember one thing, don't reload. It's the element of intent that causes people big problems, both the jury and the person who's actually involved in the event. So let me take you to the first of the SSRI drugs, Zelmet, which comes out in 1982. 20 years before that, experts using the earlier antidepressants, which also inhibited serotonin reuptake, said these can cause you to commit suicide and homicide. So that had been established back then. And also, nearly 20 years before that, people had thrown out a view that had been put forward that when people get depressed, there's something wrong with the serotonin system. By the end of the 1960s, that idea had been junked. And the man who made the first SSRI, who made Zelmet, was Arvid Carlsson, whom you see here. And Carlsson was an interesting man. He won a Nobel Prize. And, you know, he said things like, back in the early 60s or late 50s when he was doing some of the early work, he had gadgets no one else had, and he saw things no one had seen before. And because he saw things no one had seen before with a gadget you could have used as well and seen these things, people thought he was brilliant and gave him a Nobel Prize. But where he was really interesting was he listened to people who told him what these drugs do, not just where they go in the body, but what they actually do. And it was listening to people who were taking older drugs that act on the serotonin system that he got the idea that a pure serotonin reuptake inhibitor would produce a serenic effect, an anxiolytic effect. And he also didn't think there was anything wrong with the serotonin system. So it would be like giving LSD to people with a normal serotonin system. That's the system that it acts on. And you'd expect good things to happen to some people and bad things to happen to others. So he expected some people would get a helpful serenic effect on an SSRI. And when other people took an SSRI and told him they became suicidal, he heard it and he agreed. Yep, I'm not surprised that these drugs can do weird things like this. So here's the launch of Zoloft in the UK in 1993. And would you believe, on behalf of Pfizer, I am chairing this meeting and I give a talk. And I say, you know, serotonin is more primitive than estrogen. And if we now have drugs that act on it, we are going to see and hear things that we've never seen and heard before. And we need to keep our eyes and ears open. That's not the message Pfizer wanted you to hear. They didn't want you to keep your eyes and ears open. They wanted doctors to just prescribe the drug, and they wanted patients to take it. And all of that is caught in this marvelous cartoon by Michael Loenig from 30 years ago. What the companies were doing was converting cases of Valium into cases of Prozac because the SSRIs should have been anxiolytics. They're not good antidepressants, but nobody was going to believe that a new anxiolytic wouldn't cause you dependence, whereas they would believe that on an antidepressant, you wouldn't get hooked to it. So SSRIs become antidepressants and, you know, they become vitamin serotonin, which is going to correct the serotonin imbalance that has been junked by respectable research years beforehand. And the other key thing about this slide is down in the right-hand corner, you've got the doctor. Now, the consumer of these drugs is the doctor. It is not you if you put on one of them. He consumes without having an adverse effect. You have the adverse effect, he doesn't. And the company's job is to keep him feeling happy and content and having no adverse effects at all. So this is, again, part of the challenge we have that prescription only introduces into the mix. 10 years before the drugs come out to treat people who are anxious and depressed. They've been given to healthy volunteers like Tracy Johnson here, and it's made them suicidal and homicidal. And, the healthy volunteers have found these drugs hard to get off. Tracy, when she tried to get off the drugs she'd only been on for 2 or 3 weeks, she ends up actually committing suicide, and she was not the only person. So 10 years beforehand, as you're going to hear more, these drugs, the companies knew what these drugs could do. Now, I want to introduce you to something else. And in the last talk I gave for Bob, I had a few slides you're going to see again, but I'm going to say something different this time, which is back 400 years ago, the human body was becoming a machine. We had thought the heart was the seat of our soul, but it had just become a pump. And René Descartes was in the business of trying to work out how our minds fit into this new machine. And he put the soul up in the pineal gland there. And he said, look, you put your foot too close to the flame and an image goes up your ears to the pineal gland, and the soul decides it will be wise to remove your foot. And this wisdom, this obvious thinking, proved or underpinned his claim, cogito ergo sum. That is, I think, therefore I am. Well, I, the soul, thinks, and therefore I, the soul, am. And of course, when the machine disintegrates, as it will do, the soul, depending on how it's been thinking, whether it's good thinking or bad thinking, is going to go to heaven or hell. And with homicide, that's the business we're in. We're in a heaven or hell business. We're in a responsibility business. It took 200 years for us to realize Descartes was wrong, that the removing your foot from the flame was nothing to do with the soul or the brain or the mind or good and evil. It was reflex. It was automatic and unconscious. And over the following 50 to 100 years, we began to realize that almost all our behavior is automatic and reflex and unconscious. This gave rise to sentio ergo sum. I feel, therefore I am. I have hunches. A mysterious me that's no longer a machine has hunches about the right things to do. The right things to do to make sure that we don't go extinct. The people who realized the importance of this first were two guys called William James and Carl Lange, who said, look, our senses tell us what's going on in the world around us, not our brains, and what's going on in our body also. And they feed messages up to the brain, and the brain often gets the message wrong. It sort of hears all sorts of things going on. It doesn't come to the right interpretation. 10 years after these two guys, Freud comes along and says, I can interpret the automatic and unconscious messages the body gives us. And he introduced this idea of libido. Now, you and I have libido, and we've got a rough idea when it goes up and down and things like this. So, Freud's libido was a very different thing. You couldn't measure it. It wasn't the same as the libido you and I experience. But based on this, he claimed he knew more about what was going on in us than we know ourselves. And, that led Freud and the Freudians to intervene in medicine and say, we know what this heart attack is all about, why the person's actually having a heart attack. And in lawsuits where, they were the ones who could decide who was really guilty and responsible or not. Now, Freud is dead, and he's been replaced by a bunch of bio-Freudians, where he had libido, which you couldn't measure or anything like that. We have serotonin, which you can't measure, and it's nothing to do with the serotonin in you and me. But based on this serotonin, as psychiatrists figure, they know more about what's going on in you and me than we know ourselves. And the main difference between, the psychobabble with the Freudians and the biobabble with biological psychiatry now is they don't intervene in legal cases. They let companies decide whether we're guilty or not. They don't, Freud gave mental health input into law a bad name. Biological psychiatrists are doing just the same thing by not intervening. They're not engaging on our behalf to say, well, look, these are complex cases and it's not clear that the drug should be let walk free from court. They ain't doing it. So When we introduced the first drugs, the first tranquilizers like the beta blockers and the benzodiazepines, they were introduced on a James Lange basis, not a Freudian basis. They were introduced to fool the brain. My brain, looking at me giving this talk, if I'm taking a beta blocker, would see that my heart rate's not going too fast, I'm not perspiring, my hands aren't shaking too much, and would figure David Healy isn't anxious. But if my cardiologist had given me this drug to slow my heart rate because it was too fast or reduce my blood pressure, when he stopped the drug, or she stopped the drug, she'd say to me, look, when you stop this drug, your heart rate's going to speed up. You're going to think you're anxious. You're not. That's just your brain being fooled. It's all going to clear up in 48 to 72 hours. Let me tell you one more thing, though, which is again at the heart of this talk, which is 40 years ago, I had to give a beta blocker to a colleague. And, all the books say one of the most solid findings in all of medicine is you give a beta blocker and heart rates slow down. 15 minutes after she took the beta blocker, she was anxious. So we checked her heart rate and it had speeded up. Now, a key point here is this is real life. What's happening in real life, what's real is what's happening in front of you. What's in books is not real. It may be helpful. It may helpfully tell you about averages and things like that, but it's not real life. Real life is what's in front of us. And that's what doctors today have great trouble with. They are people of the book increasingly and not able to see and hear what's happening in you when you're on these drugs. Here's a guy who's not real any longer. He's only in books, T-Rex. And if you look over his eyes, there's almost no brain there. And that's because he's got a bird brain. You see the image on the right. That's the human cortex, the pink bit. And the white bit going up there is the top of the spinal cord. That's essentially T-Rex's brain, the top of the spinal cord. And it's got a blue dot and a green dot. And the blue dot is where your norepinephrine is. And the green dot is where the serotonin is. Now, if you let me say that the top of the spinal cord is part of the body and not part of the brain, then 100% of the serotonin in you and me is in our bodies and none in our brain. If you insist the top of the spinal cord is part of the brain, then 5% of the serotonin in you and me is in our brain and 95% in the rest of the body. And SSRIs act on the body, and in doing this, they fool the brain. And I'm going to tell you how. 25 years ago, a group of us had a chance to run an experiment in this unit here where I was working. And the experiment was to try and check and see whether Arvid Carlsson was right about what SSRIs do, that they produce a serenic effect. And the idea was to take a bunch of medical and nursing staff and give them either an SSRI or a non-SSRI for 2 weeks and then cross them over to the other drug and see could they put in words the difference between the two kinds of drugs. And the answer was they could, and they said, yes, SSRIs produce a serenic effect. But 1 in 10 of the group of 20 actually became suicidal on the SSRI and also became aggressive. The really interesting thing about the experiment was none of the patients in the ward knew anything about the staff being on these drugs. But after 48 hours, some of them came up to me and asked me whether that doctor is on a pill. And is he on an SSRI? And I said, yes, he is. How did you know? And they said, it's obvious. You can see the change in his body. You can see the change in his facial expressions, in his demeanor, in his personality, almost in his smell. And this was interesting because we, the Freudians, as it were, think we know what's going on in you, but the patients are much more aware of what's going on in you in ways that we don't know because they've got skin in the game. They look at us the whole time or look at colleagues of theirs on the ward who are put on pills and see what the pills are doing that we don't see. So this is, again, the brain being fooled, as you're going to see, which is, this is a PET scan experiment where you've got a normal brain there on the left, which from a bunch of people, this is the average of a bunch of people, just before they get 1 dose of an SSRI. And the brain on the right is the brain after the 1 dose of the SSRI. And the researchers say, hey, look, the SSRI has turned the brain off. And it hasn't. It's reduced the sensory input from the body to the brain, so the brain is dealing with less, and it's less active, sure, but it's not turned off by the drug acting on it. Let me explain. In the case of the SSRIs, the single commonest sensory thing you notice when you go on these drugs, 30 minutes after the first pill, is you're genitally numb. Now, you might say this could be happening because the drug has gone into the brain. It isn't. It's happening because the drug has gone to the genitals. You get exactly the same effect from lidocaine paste rubbed into the genitals. And as far as I know, lidocaine paste rubbed into the genitals doesn't get into the brain at all. So this state underpins an issue that contributes to people committing homicide, which is, you've got a quote here from Maxime Villeneuve, who says, you know, every day I'm shocked that such a state is possible. What's the state? Well, it's mental anesthesia. Everything in the mind is tuned down so low, the mind goes blank. The emotions are muted. They're barely relevant. It's the opposite of what LSD does, which also works on the serotonin system. It opens the mind up. This SSRIs close the mind down. And here's Louis XVI, the King of France in 1791, being guillotined. And you know that a bunch of women used to sit at the bottom of the guillotine and watch the heads roll down, which is not the kind of thing we do these days, except if you're on an SSRI, where people report that, you know, they used to watch the videos of the beheadings of Westerners by ISIS 10 years ago in order to feel something. They were so emotionally numb on these drugs that they had to watch something like this, pretty shocking, in order to feel anything at all. And that feeds into, I've told you, SSRIs make you genitally numb, and they mute your orgasms, and if you're on them for time, your libido drops. And everybody expects when you stop the pills, you'll be fine, but often you're not. Things are even worse, and they may remain, your sexual function may remain absent for the rest of your life. This is post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And this is one of the greatest documents in modern healthcare. It's three guys who've got PSSD who are talking about it. I encourage everyone here to get access to this and listen to what they say. I'm just going to give you two little snippets. And Bryn here is saying, getting PSSD undermines your faith in medicine and science. Now, it's not because you have PSSD that your faith is undermined. It's because of your experience when you go to a doctor. It's like going to a doctor when your arm has been chopped off and you go into the doctor and say, I've lost an arm, and he looks at you and says, you look just fine to me. The experience is doctors don't see people with this problem or listen to them. They're not taking this on board. They're kind of told this can't happen. So if you're trying to say it's happened to you, you're fooling them in some way. And the other point Bryn makes, which is key to the homicide argument, which is, you know, guys, we have a problem. No one's going to believe us, because if we said this has happened to us, they'd say FDA wouldn't let a drug could do something like this on the market. And it's the same with homicide. The reaction is FDA would not let a drug that is known to cause homicide on the market. So you're going to have a problem being believed. Now, some of you listening in won't be old enough to remember listening to Prozac, which burst on the scene 30 years ago, Peter Kramer's book, where he said, Prozac makes you better than well. It's good psychotherapy in pill form. And to try and bring the point out, he said, look, you know, I've got patients who are homosexual who I put on Prozac and they become heterosexual. 35 years before Peter Kramer, when he was possibly still in diapers, Roland Kuhn, introducing imipramine, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, said the same thing, that, you know, he had a homosexual patient who became heterosexual. The point I'm making here is that these drugs are not treating an illness as such. A lot of what they do changes personality. And we get this better than well type phenomenon. But you shouldn't expect that these drugs were given to us by God to make everything better than well. There's every chance that at least as often, if not more often, they'll make us worse than ill. And there's a marvelous book that brings this out, which is Notes on a Scandal, which is about, I mean, it's a great movie as well, if you haven't seen it. which is about a female school teacher who sexually molests her male pupils. Now, there's a lot of female school teachers who've been charged with doing this and got off because they've been able to show they were on an SSRI and their behavior has changed completely since they stopped the drug. Lots of other courts have refused to let evidence about this in. Drugs aren't mentioned in the book or the movie, but I can tell you Zoe Heller, the author, was on Prozac at the time. These drugs produce a change of personality, which your family and your friends can all see, and the patients on the ward can see. Jan Ackerblom has this marvelous program called Who Cares in Sweden, where he asks, if we care less, which is what these drugs do, and have a change of personality, are any of the contracts that we sign legally valid? Well, companies and lots of people don't really want you to hear this. The message, better than well, gets halfway around the world faster than worse than ill. It's a bit like the old thing about lies get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its boots on. And this slide here brings out the personality change aspect, which is even a bird brain, the dove of peace, you see it here throwing away the olive branch, has a change of personality on these drugs, which you may not notice, but your family and your friends and the patients on the ward where you're a member of the staff will notice it. It's very obvious that it happens very quickly. And the question is, I guess, what do we make of this? No one's really got to grips with it. So if everything gets muted and you have a change of personality, so, you're not full of raging, horrible impulses and things like that, where does the homicide come from? And you can see how being numbed might make you more likely to kill people, or maybe kill yourself, but there's got to be some source of the violence also. And that source is a phenomenon called akathisia. You can see the bird or the sheep here, or whatever it is, has changed personality, is going to shoot the fox. We got introduced to the phenomenon of akathisia by a drug acting on the serotonin system called reserpine in the 1950s, the early 1950s. It was used to treat people who had hypertension. And on it, some totally normal people who had no mental health problems reported feeling better than well, and that this was good psychotherapy in pill form. This is 40 years before Peter Kramer. But they also reported becoming tense, some of them reported becoming tense and restless and feeling very uncomfortable, and reporting increasing feelings of strangeness. I don't feel like myself. I'm afraid of some of the unusual impulses that I have. This is akathisia. And everybody agrees reserpine and the akathisia causes people to commit suicide. I don't know about the homicide, but absolutely causes people to commit suicide. So this is David Foster Wallace describing the same kind of thing, which is, you end up in a state where it's a bit like being in a burning building, and you have a choice of dying between being burnt or jumping out the window to your death. And when you jump out the window, it's not because you desire to jump out the window, it's just you're in an intolerable situation, and that's the option that you take. Now, a recent prosecutor that I was trying to explain this to, and used the quote that you see here, said, but you still have a choice, don't you? Well, I guess the key thing is, what does choice mean in these kind of circumstances? In the Korean War, when US soldiers had a gun to their head which you couldn't see off screen, and they said the United States was the evil empire, did they intend to say that? Did they really have a choice? What about Bruce Springsteen here, who's giving a similar quote, and actually his section on akathisia is about 2 or 3 pages long, and it's great. He's there saying that he couldn't live like this. He understands what drives people to the abyss when you're in this kind of state. There was no life here, just an endless, irritating, existential angst embedded in my bones. Now, note, he doesn't say his brain, and I think he's right. It's in our body, akathisia. And it was demanding answers that I did not have. Are you going to kill yourself, or are you going to kill that dude who's causing you all the problems? So on that score, 20 years ago, Prozac and most of the SSRIs come off patent. And Prozac is rebranded as Darafem, and PMS or PMT is rebranded as PMDD, a horrific illness that causes women to become aggressive at certain times of the month. Now, SSRIs may be useful at certain times of the month because of the muting that they cause. But if you look at the data from the clinical trials at the episodes of aggression, they're infinitely higher on women taking an SSRI compared with women on placebo. So this is an akathisic type state. You see the word irritability there, that they're supposed to clear up. Well, when you add an SSRI into a person who's akathisic to begin with, you make things worse, usually. And here's a further instance of that. This is persistent genital arousal disorder, just the opposite to PSSD, where women have effectively genital anesthesia rather than genital muting. And they get repeated, unwanted, unwelcome orgasms, which are terribly distressing, to the point where they contemplate a clitoridectomy and have clitoridectomies and other drastic procedures. Are these intended? I'm not inclined to think they are. But there's an important other point about this, which is when I gave a beta blocker to my colleague 40 years ago and her heart rate speeded up rather than slowed down, the one thing that couldn't happen is that it would both speed up and slow down at the same time. In the case of PSSD and PGAD, which appears to be its opposite, they can both happen at the same time. You see good cases which have both features. And what we got here is that akathisia and emotional muting can happen at the same time. So you can get violent, murderous impulses happening at the same time as you're muted to the consequences of your behavior, which is a particularly tricky state of affairs to be in. And here's one more little bit to bring into the frame about choice and intent. This is Anne-Marie Kelly, who has told the world that SSRIs can make you alcoholic, as they made her. And she's been proven right. The question here is, why would a drug like this, how would it go about making you alcoholic? And there's probably a few things it can do, but one of these things is that it can be a treatment for akathisia. You may be restless on the drug, you take a glass of wine and you feel a lot better. So people take the wine in order to manage the problem the drug is causing. And there was a legal case in the UK, which is fairly interesting recently, where a girl who had fetal alcohol syndrome took an action because her mother had been drinking while she was pregnant with the girl and caused all this damage, and the girl was looking for support. And the court said, well, you can't have any because you were a fetus at the time, and a fetus is not a person, so you can't be criminally injured. But what I want to pick up here is when you look at the epidemiology of pregnant women taking SSRIs versus pregnant women not on SSRIs, you find that the women taking the SSRIs have a tenfold greater chance of having a child with fetal alcohol syndrome, even though every woman knows these days you shouldn't drink during pregnancy. There's signs up in all the restaurants we go to saying, if you're pregnant, don't drink. You know, this is not something hidden. Everybody knows it and gets told it the whole time. But on these drugs, you find it impossible not to drink compulsively, not just the occasional drink, but to drink compulsively on them. So again, this comes back to how much choice do we have when we're on these drugs and things are going wrong for us? How much responsibility should we be told is ours? So let me take you to Katinka Newman's wonderful book, The Pill That Steals Lives. Unbeknownst to herself, Katinka had had a prior bad reaction to a serotonin reuptake inhibiting antihistamine. Many, many years later, she gets put on one again and has a bad reaction to it. But this time, the doctor seeing her halts that and puts her on an SSRI instead. And she has a much worse state. She becomes delirious, frenzied. She believes she stabbed her children to death. She has, in fact, cut her own wrists. And that leads to her being brought into hospital. And where she's, she won't watch the TV because she's sure the news bulletins are going to be talking about this awful woman who has killed her two children. As the effect of the SSRI wears off, she becomes aware that it's probably the drug that caused all this, and she tries to tell the treating staff that the drug is the problem. They don't listen. They tank her full of drugs for a year. They steal a year of her life until her insurance runs out, and she gets chucked out of hospital, and the pills stop, and she comes back to normal. The book is great. Now, here's a book that's due out next March on the right-hand side, which is very similar. It's a man called David Crespi actually does kill two of his daughters. And it brings up the same issues as are in Tinker's book. It's a more complex case in loads of ways because he does get charged with the murder, and you can see how the legal system grapples or fails to grapple with the issues that are going on here. And I've got some points that may help bring out what happens to David Crespi and Katinka, which are as follows. A few weeks ago, I was talking to a lady who had been on an SSRI a long time before, and she'd had some problems from it, and she hadn't ever told anyone about a further problem she had, which was, she'd been at a party, and she wanted to get herself a drink, and while she went over towards where the drinks were, she brushed past another woman whom she didn't know. And as she did, she had this violent impulse to hurt the other woman for no obvious reason. Now, these episodes have continued to happen every so often for the last 30 years or so, even though for almost all of that time, she hasn't been on any drugs. She's learned that these aren't the true her, that she just needs to manage them. They happen for reasons that she has no idea about. She just needs to breathe deeply and they'll go away. They don't, they don't, she's unsure what's going on, but she's stopped thinking that they reflect the fact that she's evil. Now, many years before that, I was called to see a man who had had a mild stroke. And when I saw him, he had been put on an SSRI by the treating team because they thought he should be recovering from the stroke quicker. When I came to see him, he didn't seem to me to be depressed or that an SSRI was going to help him, so I stopped it. And I came back a few days later just to make sure I hadn't done the wrong thing. And he said to me, "I'm pleased to see you. Since you stopped those pills, the terrible thoughts have gone." And I said, "What terrible thoughts?" And he said, "Well, you see across the ward, that man over there, I don't know him at all. But while I was on those pills, I had this impulse to get up in the middle of the night and go over and strangle him. And since those pills have stopped, I'm not having those thoughts anymore." I had a man recently as well who reported having horrific nightmares when he was on SSRIs, and this can happen with all these drugs, and they can happen on withdrawal as well. And he's been off the drugs for 30 years, but the nightmares have come back. And they're so awful that he can't tell me what the content is. And this may be in part because SSRIs can cause not just nightmares, but lucid dreaming, where you're left unsure, did this really happen, or was I dreaming? So one of the other things is if you're in bed with your partner and you want to kill him, usually, you're dreaming about killing him, usually your motor system's turned off, so nothing happens. But SSRIs can inhibit the turning off so that actually you can start trying to strangle him. Another thing that happens is, at a man, I usually won't let a husband bring his wife in for a consult. But this man insisted because she won't tell you the truth if I'm not there. So he came in, and I asked her what happened. And she said, "Well, I started venlafaxine and I took my clothes off and went out on the main road naked." And I asked her, "Why did you do that?" And she said, "A voice told me to." This is what's called a command hallucination, which we tend to obey. And if you remember, Christopher Pitman talked about a voice telling him to do things. People often say it's the voice of God, but we've no idea what God's voice actually sounds like. But her problem cleared up. She was a very normal woman who really shouldn't have been put on these drugs at all, and the problem cleared up once we took her off the drug. So all of these things can happen and contribute to the events that we're looking at. Where does these are all happening in the body. They're not happening up in the mind, the cortex of the brain. where does your cortex and mind come into the picture? Well, this is the organ that pharmaceutical companies program to get you thinking the way they want you to think. And how do they do it? Well, this is an image to represent something that happened in one of Pfizer's trials, where a man becomes horribly akathisic on one of their drugs and pours gasoline on himself and sets fire to it, intending to kill himself. But he doesn't die there and then. He dies from his burns 5 days later, and if you're reading the accounts of this trial, you see him coded as death by burns, when you get hold of the narrative account, which FDA may never have seen, there's a legal obligation when things like this happen for the company to explain just what went on. You see that this really should be coded as death by suicide. Now, here's a young man. This is not the actual man, but in study 329, which is Paxil given to teenagers who are depressed. This young 15-year-old is given Paxil and 2 weeks later is out on the street waving a gun around, threatening to kill people. The police come along and bring him to hospital, and there should be a narrative report telling you and me and FDA what happened. There isn't. FDA to this day, as far as I know, don't know what happened to this boy or the 3 other children who had events happen to them that GSK used a kind of loophole that they found and other companies have found, which mean that they don't have to inform the regulator about what's actually going on to the patients in these trials. This is a further aspect of what goes on, which is these are data from the trials that brought these 3 SSRI drugs on the market. And you see, under the word screening, we've removed people from the antidepressants they were on beforehand, and there's a withdrawal period of a week or 2 where a lot of suicidal events happen. Now, this is the riskiest period of all in these trials, but it's also a period where the companies looked at it and said, well, people in this period aren't on any drugs, so that's the same as being suicidal on placebo. So when we show the data to FDA, we'll move all those events over into the placebo column. This is a breach of regulations. You'd like to say it's fraud, but you can't, because as the company said, FDA saw exactly what we did and they didn't object. Here's Pfizer's Zoloft. And Pfizer have run 4 trials on Zoloft in PTSD. In all 4 trials, the results from men were negative. It didn't work. In 2 of the trials, there was a marginal benefit in women, and based on those 2 trials, Pfizer were able to persuade FDA to license Zoloft for PTSD. And they wrote those 2 trials up, and they picked their favorite journal. It's the pharmaceutical industry's favorite journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, because it gets the most sales when you have an article there. And the article's been written, as you see in the text there, and over on the left, you see author TBD, to be determined. That is, Pfizer's marketing department will pick a prof of psychiatry or whatever from Harvard or Yale or Oxford or Cambridge or Paris or Berlin or whatever, and use them as the authors on these trials, the ones that are going to be best for marketing purposes. These guys or girls will not have seen the data. The ghostwriter who writes the articles up, who wrote the articles up, won't have seen the data. FDA won't get to see the data. The journal won't get to see the data. No one gets to see the data. The greatest concentration of fake news on this earth centers on the drugs your doctor gives you, not just the SSRIs, but all of them. I told you about study 329, Paxil given to teenagers, and that had appeared in 2001 in a glowingly positive report saying this drug works wonderfully well and is free of problems. A year later, GSK applied to FDA to get Paxil licensed for teenagers who are depressed, and tell FDA that studies 329, 377, and 701 were all negative. And FDA agreed with them, they were all negative. But they still say they'll approve Paxil for teenagers who are depressed. And they also say we agree with GSK's suggestion that they shouldn't have to mention the negative trials in the label of the drug. Why not? Well, someone might charge GSK with fraud if there's an article out there saying the drug works wonderfully well and the label says it doesn't. and we wouldn't want GSK to be charged with fraud. How often does this happen? Well, here are the studies that brought the same antidepressants that we've been talking about on the market in adults. And you see they're almost all glowingly positive. Look at the column 3 from the left, that's 3 from the right, that's Zoloft, boxes 61 and 62. This is the drug that many people recommend, many experts recommend is the best SSRI, the best evidence for the drug being useful and free of problems. So it's the one you should use. But this is the published literature. The FDA have seen a different side to these drugs, where if you take all the trials done in adults and children, you find that more than half of these were negative. The drug didn't work. And 1/3 of the previously positive trials you saw were actually negative trials, which the company's written up as positive. So this happens very commonly. And look at the column 3 from the right, the Zoloft column. There's only one positive trial, and FDA, strictly speaking, need 2 positive trials in order to license a drug. In fact, if you look at the Zoloft data, it's the worst of the drugs there, and it's probably the last one you should use based on this data. Now, here's what are the companies up to doing all this? Well, here's what they're up to. This is a John the Baptist ad preparing the way for the citalopram messiah that's about to come along soon. And it's telling you that we have a drug that's terribly specific. It'll go right to the heart of the problem and put that right and won't affect the rest of the body at all. Everybody will be left just absolutely perfect. Things are going to be sorted out with this drug. This is a magic bullet image, which gives the narrative to the company. It's just the only job for doctors to give the drug. The only job for the patient is to take it. In contrast, Arvid Carlsson had a therapeutic principle view of SSRIs when he made them, which was, like LSD, they may do useful things for some people and not so good things for others. It's a bit like laxatives. There's 4 different kinds of laxatives. There's 4 different kinds of constipation, and the trick is to get the laxative that's going to sort the constipation you have out. And doctors and mothers used to be good at working this out. But when a company gets a license to claim their drug's a laxative, they only want everybody who's got constipation to be on them. And they don't mind if you're on all of the other kinds as well, provided you're on theirs. But this is a recipe for treatment-resistant constipation. In the same way, it's the same with SSRIs and the other therapeutic principles we have to treat nervous problems. As Arvid Carlsson is going to demonstrate to you now, the serenic effect of an SSRI can be a good treatment for OCD. And I had a man some years ago who had OCD, and I put him on an SSRI. Didn't help. We increased the dose. We added in other things. Nothing helped. And a few weeks later, he comes back having stopped all of what he called my drugs. And he told me he'd taken up smoking and that he'd done his own research before he took up smoking. And he found that nicotine was a good treatment for some people with OCD. And he showed me a bunch of papers to show the research he'd done. And the top paper, curiously, had Arvid Carlsson's name in it. Carlsson had listened to people, and this is what made him create the SSRIs. He had also listened to patients saying, your drug doesn't work for me, and listened to them when they said, nicotine works a lot better and actually can be a lot safer than an SSRI. And he'd publish a paper saying that nicotine is a good therapeutic principle for some people with OCD. That hands the narrative back to doctors and patients rather than companies. There's a clinical skill, us working together to find the right drug for you rather than just putting you on a drug because the company says to us that's what we have to do. Now, that's all to do with the cortex of the brain and the company shaping the way we think. Here's another aspect of the cortex of the brain in this book here, which many of you will have read, and if you haven't, you should. It's a great book. Which is about thinking fast and slow. Daniel Kahneman doesn't actually say our body does most of the thinking, but he does say, we operate on the basis of stereotypes and hunches, on the basis of our feelings and sensations, and we get it right most of the time. If we didn't, we'd be extinct. But there are times when we get it wrong, and that's when we need to think slowly. And you get the impression that the slow thinking happens in the cortex of the brain, and particularly in the frontal lobes, which are felt to be the executive part of the brain. They say it's where the ghost is, if it's anywhere. And this is the place in the brain where, because we think slowly and solve problems well, this is the bit that does science and does philosophy and ensures that we live a good life rather than an evil life. Except that's not the case. If you look at the cords hanging down there, there's one like one of these in loads of bathrooms, and you walk in and you pull it, and you often end up in a dark bathroom. We all act a little bit like Alice in Wonderland from time to time. We find a bit of food with a label on it saying, "Eat me," and we don't think, we just do that. Or a drink with a label on it saying, "Drink me," and we do it, even though it might not be sensible to. It's the same with the cords. They have a label, you don't see it, saying, "Pull me," and we pull it. And no matter how often we make the mistake, we continue to make mistakes like this. We don't learn, in a sense. But if we're not absent-minded, our frontal lobes are what stop us making the mistake. We put two and two together, as it were. Now, if you got a frontal lobe problem, what happens is not that you become evil or not actually become a scientist or whatever. You may see a filthy hairbrush on the floor, and you know it's not yours, and you pick it up and you brush your hair with it. You become environmentally dependent. And like this man here, whose x-rays these are, if you see people of the opposite sex, whether they're young or old, you may sexually molest them and be charged criminally. In his case, it was recognized that he had a tumor of the frontal lobes, and when that was removed, he was restored to normal and acquitted. Extraordinarily, a few years later, he becomes a pedophile again, and the tumor is regrown, and it's removed again, and he comes back to normal. So SSRIs produce what's called frontal lobe behavior, and just like the tumor, they can be removed, and we can be acquitted, except we don't get acquitted. There's no pharmaceutical company, there's no tumor-selling company that's in the business of trying to make sure we don't blame the tumor. So let me introduce you to one more quick thing, which is catatonia. Most of you will know that when faced with something threatening, we can fight or flee. Some of you will know we can fight, flee, or freeze. Catatonia is the freezing state. So let's say we freeze. Then, one of the things that happens to us is our intention goes out the window. We cannot intend to do anything. It just stops functioning. And often what will happen is if you come up to me and I'm frozen and you gesture to me, I'll copy your gesture, mirror image it, or I might actually do the opposite, a reverse mirror image. And these are all unintended, okay? People with catatonia don't usually kill people because they're frozen, but you can get an overactive form of catatonia where people race around things, breaking things, being very destructive. And again, you'd figure if they did kill someone, that they don't intend it. Now, catatonia is a bodily problem. It's a physical problem. It's a neurological problem. It is not a mental illness. It can be caused by physical illnesses. It can be caused by an emotional shock. But its commonest cause is a drug. It's caused by antipsychotic drugs acting on the motor system. Now, the problems we've been talking about are rather like a sensory catatonia. The SSRIs are causing something like a sensory catatonia. It's more like the overactive form of catatonia. We don't have a good word for it, but just like in catatonia, we don't think anyone who's got this condition intends things. It's the same way, I think, to some extent at least, with the SSRIs when things go wrong. So let me quickly take you to a few cases and end with them. The man on the left is a man who I think had the clearest case of drug-induced homicide I've ever seen. He was put on an SSRI for a minor problem. He used to keep a diary before this, and you can see in his diary he starts talking about feeling strange once he goes on this drug. He begins to think about, he's going mad. Begins to think he's going to be locked up in hospital. And over the course of a week, he's getting more and more agitated. His wife, whom you see on his left, gets friends in who know him to look at him, and they all agree he's more agitated than anyone they've ever seen before. He's pacing up and down. He's pulling his hair out. Nobody expects what happens next, which is he wakes up one day after about 6-7 days on the pills and batters his wife to a pulp, dead. He goes into hospital. They halt the drugs, and he returns to normal. So I'm there looking at all this and figure, this man's not guilty. And I write, this man should be let walk free from court. He's not guilty. But his lawyers decide the best strategy is a plea deal. The court will take this into account and sentence him to 1 year. And they persuade him this is the right way forward, that he mightn't get off, if he doesn't opt for this. Now, before he goes into hospital, nobody thinks he's a murderer. When he comes out, the lawyers have made him a convicted murderer, and no one in the town where he's lived for 50 years is going to talk to him. He ends up having to leave the town and leave the country. The gun on the right is James Holmes, who's a very similar story, which is he's a shy and inhibited little fella who gets put on Zoloft, and he's also been keeping a diary and describes the changes in him, which he puts in terms of manic delirium. And he says to the doctor treating him, if you knew the thoughts that were in my head, you'd lock me up. And she says, well, you're responsible for your thoughts. So Holmes ends up shooting dead 12 people and seriously injuring 72. I don't think the drug has caused the problem until I get to interview him and I become persuaded the drug has caused the problem and write a report to that effect and introduce a bunch of Zoloft documents that will be interesting, which you're about to see. But the defense don't use my report. And my sense has always been that they came to a deal with the prosecution, that they would argue a mental illness a defense. He had no shred of a mental illness. That's what gets argued, and the jury aren't convinced he's got mental illness, so he's found guilty. But the deal, I suspect, is that one juror would say he shouldn't be executed. Instead, he gets a 3,000-year sentence. He would have preferred to be executed. Now, I told you about some documents that could have been brought into his case. And here's one. This is a diary kept by a healthy volunteer on a Zoloft trial in 1983, so 10 years before this drug comes to the market. And on day 3, she's saying that she's feeling aggressive in relationships and whilst driving. She's talking about things like fatigue. And the other people on this drug are all of the people taking Zoloft, and none of the controls are reporting this kind of thing. And by day 4, every single one of the Zoloft participants drops out. Now, they're all on 200 milligrams Zoloft, which is not a small dose. Pfizer review this, and this is the document over on the left, and the bit I've pulled out is the bit where their guy says, look, Zoloft caused this, and it's well known that drugs like this can cause this kind of problem. This is more severe than what we usually see, and maybe, it's not caused by any drug interaction or anything else. It may be just these volunteers were susceptible to the drug. And here's a little snippet from an SSRI trial bringing one of them onto the market, where the doctor looking at the patient has done Hamilton rating scale scores, and according to these, the patient's getting better, so he's going to be a success for the drug, until he interviews the patient, who tells him, look, I'm having feelings of killing other people and myself. So how often does this happen in SSRI trials of patients? Well, the answer is roughly 1 in 20. You've seen in the healthy volunteer trial with Zoloft that we did years before that, that 1 in 10 people became aggressive and suicidal on Zoloft. And you've seen in Pfizer's Zoloft healthy volunteer trial in 1983 that 100% of the volunteers became agitated and aggressive. So this is Marilyn Lamack. who for most people who know her was Superwoman. She was the head nurse of a very busy hospital ward. Um, she was juggling 3 children and a husband who was over busy and who was away a lot. And she was doing a lot of good work in the community. She was doing a lot of things to help other people. And everybody was awfully surprised when the events that happened, which was she thought her husband was going to divorce her. So she went along to her family doctor, Dr. Hubbard, and said, look, I think he's thinking about leaving me. And Dr. Hubbard and she agreed Zoloft was not the answer to a problem like that. So she comes back a few weeks later and she's more anxious and more sure that her husband's going to divorce her. And Dr. Hubbard says, well, let's try Zoloft. It can't do any harm. So he puts her on a low dose of Zoloft and over a few months increases the dose 4 times until she's on 200 milligrams. As the dose goes up, she gets more agitated. She gets more anxious rather than less anxious. She has side effects that only SSRIs cause, like jaw clenching. She's got the fatigue and other problems that the healthy volunteers in the Pfizer trial had. But on 200 milligrams, Dr. Hubbard asks her how she's doing, and she says, I couldn't care about the divorce. I'm not as worried about it as I was before. At this stage, her husband was sleeping openly with another woman. So the divorce was happening, but she wasn't as bothered. And then a few days later, on March the 4th, 1999, she calls the emergency services and says, look, I've killed my 3 children, Emily, Nicholas, and Thomas, and I've tried to kill myself. You better get over here. Marilyn, I should have said, had no mental health problems at all. After Emily was born, she was concerned that she put on a bit of weight, was keen to hang on to her husband, so she put on a bit of weight, and she got put on Prozac because it had a reputation for causing weight loss at that time, but it didn't suit her at all. She did much better when she was changed to a stimulant, which caused weight loss. That's the only exposure to mental health drugs she'd ever had before taking Zoloft. So when she got picked up by the police, she was put in hospital and jail and tanked full of drugs. The experts who came to see her had no expertise in this area. They didn't look at the idea of taking her off the drugs. Nobody was interested in the question about whether the libido-reducing effect of Zoloft might have gotten in the way of Marilyn being able to save the marriage. If she'd been able to make love, maybe things would have turned out differently. They really didn't have a clue. So she ends up in court. The defense's only option is to play the mental illness card, and the prosecution asks all her friends, friend after friend gets brought into court, did she look mentally ill to you? And everybody says, absolutely not. No. The only person who says anything different is her father, who says, for the last few months, she was not the Marilyn that we knew. So she's found guilty, and the judge, looking at her, snarls, you're going to jail for life, and I hope you think of your children every day you're in there. So she ends up in jail. She's on the meds. I mean, she doesn't give any testimony in court. She's tanked full of drugs. She's clearly akathisic. She's agitated. She's a zombie. She ends up in jail, and after she's been there for a few years, she stops all the pills, and she turns out to be just fine. It took her about 10 years to begin to think maybe the Zoloft had played a part in all this, but she's in there still, 25 years later. So I'm not going to ask you, do you think Marilyn was guilty or not? I'm not even going to ask you, do you think she got a fair trial? In Illinois at that time, you couldn't argue that the drug had caused the problem. But if you could, and they've changed the law since, so you could argue it, it would have been possible it would still have been possible for the defense to bring in all the Zoloft documents and more that I've shown you, but they didn't. There wasn't a hint of all that. I'm not going to ask you, could you get a fair trial? I don't think you could. If you or one of your children and increasingly it's our kids getting put on these drugs, let's say they kill someone, could they get a fair trial? And my answer is I don't think they could. The question I'm asking you is, how do we put the system right so that we have, it's a broken system. How do we put it right? Can we put it right? And maybe we can't, because, as Bryn said, no one's going to believe us if we say that FDA licensed a drug that could cause homicide. They're just not going to believe it. No one's going to believe that the New England Journal of Medicine and all the best journals, the Bibles, could be selling fake news the whole time. No one's going to believe that. No one's going to believe the serried ranks of profs of psychiatry from Harvard, Yale, and all the best institutions when they come along and say, no, there's no earthly way these drugs could cause the problem. They may be saying it, they may all be on one side and David Healy on the other, but you'll be lucky if you get anyone like me, because increasingly there are zero experts who are likely to be able or willing to come into court to argue the case for you. You might have a good doctor, a Dr. Hubbard, whom you like a lot and think is a good doctor. The jury may think he's awfully sympathetic in court. They're not going to realize or believe that his lawyers would say to him, you cannot blame the drug. You have to blame your patient, because if the jury agree the drug has caused the problem, you, the doctor, may be charged with involuntary homicide. How do we put this situation right? Can we put it right? Thanks for listening to me.